Hello, I'm Bipper the Broken, and this is my new YouTube channel. In my first video, I'm going to be telling the story of a night I won't be forgetting anytime soon. Before we begin, I would like to clarify that the story I'm about to tell, as well as some other crazy stories I plan to make videos on in the future, take place while I was spending time in a therapeutic wilderness program. I would like to make it absolutely clear my opinions on these programs. Like many who have attended these programs, I firmly believe what they are doing should be illegal and find their continued existence morally disgusting. That being said, bad experiences often lead to good stories, and this therapy program is the same, at least in my case. If you want to actually learn about the true nature of these programs, I suggest you go to a channel that was designed for that purpose and uses survivors' testimony. Finally, I want to say my experience with these programs is probably different than most. My parents did at least the most basic research and decided not to send me to one of Utah's death camps, instead sending me to a wilderness in a southern state that did not yet have a death count, which was surprisingly rare. Now hopefully I can be successful on YouTube, while also bringing attention to this very real problem that is ruining children's lives. Now that that's been addressed, let's get into the video. Okay, so in my wilderness we had an every other day hiking schedule, meaning you woke up, ate something, packed up the camp, hiked, set up the new camp, ate something, went to sleep, tried to entertain yourself for the entire next day, went to bed, and then repeat. Now the length and duration of each hike vary greatly depending on how merciful the staff were and whether any other wilderness groups were nearby. Now, at the time this story takes place, I was already considered an experienced member of the program, at least compared to the newbies. I had been in the program for about 6 weeks and had sort of fallen into the routine. I knew the absolute basics of not dying in the woods. So the hike on this fateful day to me was longer than usual, but it was nothing compared to the hell I would go through about 3 weeks later. I do plan to make a future video on that, by the way. Anyway, the point is, everyone was tired and relieved to set up camp and eat our granola and oats, or GNO as we called it. Fast forward a few hours, our camp and shelters have been set up, and it's getting dark out. However, someone realized that we hadn't had P-meal yet. P-meal is just short for personal meal, which is really just a fancy way of saying snack time. This combined with the fact that the staff was already stressed out from our unrelenting complaints and arguments about the hike, they probably wanted to keep us from talking to each other, a near impossible feat, caused them to break one of the program's rules, and they allowed us to chow down on our apples, Starkist tuna packets, and peanut butter tortillas in our sleeping shelters. Sadly, this rule existed for a reason which we would understand later that night. After finishing P-meal, we went back to the main camp and played cards, read aloud some book nobody liked, and just chilled for an hour or two. Then it was time to bear hang and set off to the sleeping shelters to go to sleep. On the way there, however, I was walking with a group of 2 staff and like 5 other kids, when one kid who had rushed ahead burst through the bushes in front of us, screaming, "Bear! Bear!" Our reaction was as funny as it was divided. The 2 newer kids immediately bolted back to the main campsite and were now also screaming, "Bear! Bear!" Whereas 2 other kids immediately asked staff if they could go see it. I just kind of stood there shocked and watched as the last kid, the 17-year-old football player from Alabama, picked up the wooden cooking spoon we had forgotten to clean and marched in the direction the bear supposedly was while yelling, "We're going hunting, boys!" Before he could engage the bear in mortal combat, however, staff yelled at him to get back to the main camp, and he listened, disappointing us all. At this point, none of us had actually seen the bear except for the one kid who had come running through the bushes, so we were all just sitting in the main camp waiting for the staff to investigate, and it started raining a little bit. So all 10 students and 2 of the staff were huddled under one giant tarp, and it quickly became clear there were 2 very different outlooks on this situation. Me and some of the other more experienced kids were sitting near the fire playing Cambio, while the newbies were having mental breakdowns on the other side of the tarp, firmly believing they were going to be slaughtered by the bear at any moment. Eventually, their incoherent rambling started annoying us, so we did what the program constantly told us we should strive to do in situations like that, and we calmly explained that the bear was likely already gone and was no harm to them. Yeah, fuck no, we laughed at them, told lies about how many people the average bear killed, and generally terrified them in any way we could think of. After 20 minutes or so, the staff came back and said they didn't see a bear, and that there probably wasn't a bear to begin with. The kid who had initially seen the bear repeated that he was sure he had seen a bear. But the kids thought he was stupid, and the staff probably just didn't want to believe him, knowing the company's rule for when there was a bear sighting, which we would discover a few minutes later when we arrived at our sleeping shelters. We all strained our eyes looking for the bear, but it was dark out, we were tired, and really didn't give a shit either way, so we started getting our sleeping gear ready. I had just wrangled my sleeping bag from the bottom of my hiking backpack when I heard a shout, "It's in my shelter!" We immediately dropped what we were doing to go see, and what do you know, there's a black bear directly under this kid's tarp, eating from a bag of nuts he had forgotten to take back to bear hang. It wasn't long before the staff arrived and tried to scare it off by blowing whistles while telling us to go back to the main camp. So we head back and start complaining relentlessly to the one staff that came with us. Now at this point it was fully dark out and we were tired and angry. Soon after, the three staff returned and said they had scared off the bear, but now that it knew where our camp was, program policy said we had to move campsites that very night. This didn't make sense to me then, and it doesn't make sense to me now. If the bear was scared off, then even if it knows where the campsite is, why would it come back while we were still there? Maybe I'm wrong. I'm no expert on black bear behavior, so feel free to correct me in the comments. Anyway, whether or not the decision was logical made no difference on our reaction. We flat out refused to do 2 hikes in one day, especially not in the dark. Luckily, the program had transports 24/7 for exactly this scenario. So a big van for us and a pickup truck for our gear set out from base camp to transport us to a new campsite. However, if you've ever been down a backcountry roads, you know they are not easy to navigate. Every road was dirt, and they twisted and turned constantly to go around hills and stuff. So staff told us the van would probably take an hour or so to reach us, so we settled down at the main camp. The staff were really mad at us because of how badly they thought we handled the bear situation, so they didn't trust us and said they were going to get our sleeping gear for us, which we most certainly weren't complaining about, although we were complaining about plenty of other things. The staff were stressed out and even more tired than we were, so one kid saw this as an opportunity to get a good review from the staff for the week. And so he said things like, "They're trying their best," and "I appreciate your efforts," whenever the staff were listening. Looking back on it, he was probably the most rational person that night, but that didn't stop him from getting a lot of the students' anger for supporting the staff. And I've kind of already mentioned it, but I'd like to stress that we were pissed. We had never stayed up that late on a hike day before, so everyone was stressed, exhausted, and angry. Eventually, the staff started getting angry and told us to be quiet repeatedly. But what would usually happen was we would all just sit in awkward silence for a couple minutes, but then someone would start whispering or crying or yelling at staff. And so like this, an hour goes by. Now, the staff has gathered all our gear in a giant pile, except for the kid whose shelter the bear was actually in. Apparently, program policy also stated that if a bear gets that close to gear, you have to leave it. Or maybe it was something else, but they didn't take his gear for some reason, which would cause a problem for that kid later. Anyway, the truck was supposed to have arrived at this point, but it was nowhere to be seen. So staff went out into the woods and called the transporters with a phone they like to pretend they didn't have, and got bad news. After he came back, the staff huddled up and discussed it. After much complaining on our part, they told us that the van that was supposed to transport us had got a flat tire and they didn't have a spare. Not only that, but since the van was in the front of the procession and the dirt roads were run lane, the entire transport team would be delayed for even longer. Eventually, they got the van back to base, only to decide they couldn't use it for that night. So instead of packing all 10 kids into a single van, they had to send up like 4 pickup trucks. Now, I don't know exactly when because we weren't allowed to know the time, so all periods of time in this video are just my best estimate, but I'd say about another hour later, the 3 pickups finally arrived at our camp. We loaded all our gear onto them, and then realized we had another problem. Not including the driver, there was the passenger seat and then 3 other seats in each pickup truck. However, due to yet another company policy, students weren't allowed to sit in the passenger seat of vehicles. This meant that one kid had to be left behind with one staff to wait for a second trip. And I would be lying if I said I didn't chuckle when the staff supporter from earlier was chosen to stay behind with the staff we called the she-beast because everyone hated her so much. I'll discuss why in a later video. But safe to say, his responsible actions backfired tremendously. Anyway, I ended up in the second pickup truck with 2 of the kids I could actually tolerate for more than a few minutes. And that car ride was definitely my favorite experience during my entire stay. Despite the horrible circumstances and the fact that our transporter was so pissed that he had been woken up that he refused to play music on the car radio when we asked. I was a person that disliked camping before my time in therapeutic wilderness and hated it during and after my stay. And I gotta tell you, feeling air conditioning after 6 weeks of being forced to do brutal hikes in the sun and rain with the only way being to cool down, being to drink water, was probably, no, certainly, the closest I have ever been to true bliss before or since. I honestly can't put into words how it felt, but it was clear the other kids felt the same way. We also saw exactly what time it was thanks to the clock on the truck's control panel, and these 2 things meant so much to us that it was all we talked about for the entire 20-minute car ride. The conversation went something like this. "Holy shit, I forgot AC exists. Don't you swear." "Oh my god, that feels so nice. I'd never want to go outside again." "Can't we just steal the car and never walk again?" "Can you drive?" "Hell no, but I'll figure it out if I can stay near these blessed air vents for longer." "Oh my fucking god, guys. It's 11:52. It's 11:52. What? Oh my god, it is." Okay, that might be a slight exaggeration, but safe to say we were behaving like castaways eating chocolate after years of coconuts. The car ride only lasted about 20 minutes though. Then we were dropped off on the side of a gravel road in the now pouring rain, waiting for the last kid to arrive so we could finally go to sleep. Another 20 minutes later, we were all there and all exhausted as hell. The staff decided we would be sleeping slumber party style, which meant setting up our 2 biggest tarps beside each other and packing all 14 of us in like sardines. Now, for most of us, this was slightly annoying because one of the staff snored, but it wasn't like we were about to put on the effort to set up our own shelters. However, that one kid whose sleeping gear was left behind was in for a very rough night. While the rest of us had a ground tarp and a cheap foam pad between us and the dirt, he only had a ground tarp. However, the much bigger issue was that he didn't have a sleeping bag, which meant he was laying on a tarp in the middle of the freezing night using another tarp that was damp from the rain as a blanket. I felt bad for him and I'd like to pretend I was the saint who did something about it, but in reality the staff gave him an extra sweater, some gloves, and socks to lessen the chances of him freezing to death while I tried to tune out the sound of him constantly shifting position. I eventually fell asleep more because of exhaustion more than anything. The new kid, like that kid got new sleeping gear at Restock a few days later, and it became another hilarious story I hope to profit off of. So this was the first of many comically tragic videos I plan to make, and I've heard that the algorithm likes certain phrases, so like and subscribe, leave a comment, and give me free publicity.